Hello everyone and welcome to building custom blockchains with Substrate. Remember, this is introductory course. My name is Bedir and I'm here to basically just show you and introduce you to the world of how to build your own custom blockchain setup using the Substrate blockchain framework. First off, I just want to say that you should have some prior development experience to this course, as in you should have some semblance of how to program or code in some capacity, whether that's JavaScript, TypeScript, or some other programming language. But we'll be using Rust and installing Rust and various dependencies later on. But I just want to preface that this isn't for complete and utter beginners. This is for people with some semblance of what software development is and how to do it. To start off, this course was based off of an initial Notion template that I had written, and it contains actually the entirety of this course in writing. So if you want to, I'll leave it below in the either video description or in a resources doc right after this video. This essentially outlines our curriculum. So first we'll go into a nice intro to Substrate. We'll go into what are Substrate palettes, the runtime and storage, and take a deeper dive into what makes up a node of the Substrate blockchain framework. We'll download our dependencies, we'll install and use a Substrate node template, and then finally, we'll actually create and test our first blockchain module, or palette as it's called. So yeah, again, I'll leave all of this here, and there's some more stuff down here which we'll get into later. However, I'm super excited to teach this course and to get started building a custom blockchain module with you guys. As basic as it is, it'll give you a really good feeling of what it's like and things to keep in mind when you're developing a Web3 backend or application. Alright guys, see you in the next video. Alright, and welcome back to the intro to Substrate section. Now, for the first few videos, I'm going to just be using the Notion template here to go through some of the material. However, don't worry, we'll be in the terminal and in the IDE as soon as possible, and we'll actually be developing in real time, and I'll be showing you the exact code you need to write to make your blockchain and blockchain module run and do its thing. But first, and it's very important to preface, what exactly is Substrate and exactly what is blockchain, because the definitions vary and it's super important to really know what you're getting yourself into when learning this new technology. So, as we said before, and I went ahead and just made this bigger here. As we said before, you should have some familiarity with coding or software development. You should be able to use an IDE or text editor or code editor of some kind. You should be comfortable being in the terminal for a little bit. And of course, have that installed in either Linux, macOS, or Windows. So let's kind of dive into what is blockchain, and we'll keep this super brief. Blockchain at its very core and what it does, it keeps a linked collection of set records, and these records are verified by a collection of nodes. So within a blockchain versus a regular backend, you may have one central backend server verifying information coming in. However, a blockchain is different. A blockchain relies on a network of different servers, or nodes as they're called. And these nodes collectively come to consensus on what data is correct and what data is not correct. And these rules are agreed upon within the network and within the consensus mechanism. And the consensus mechanism is pretty self-explanatory. It involves either a bunch of different algorithms, and you can do your own research on that on your own. Blockchains are state management machines, and we change that state by submitting transactions. Each time we submit a new transaction, the network checks it and it decides whether to include it or not. In our case, our transactions are not even going to be monetary in the slightest. We're actually going to use the same concepts of verifying monetary data or balances or whatever you have it, and instead apply those same concepts to basically logging information and metadata about a user. You can think of this as a basis for a social media, so like a user profile or an about me section, stuff like that. So to sum it up, a blockchain is a technology or collection of nodes that keeps track of the state of a chain of information that's always changing, and it keeps track of who, when, and whether it was valid or not, whenever a new piece of information is uploaded to it. There's obviously a lot more, but to keep it brief, we'll move on from there. So if we have blockchain, then what is Substrate? Well, developing on blockchain is pretty difficult, and a lot of people looking to move from Web 2 to Web 3 find this the hardest part, which is how do I start developing on blockchain? There's a bunch of different blockchains with different protocols and different ways of developing a Web3 application. Even then, the concept of Web3 changes a lot, or the concept of blockchain changes a ton. So what Substrate does is it allows us to it gives us the ability to build our own blockchain from scratch. It's a framework for building blockchains. So it takes care of all the hard parts so we can focus on building the fun part, which are the applications. So let's say we want to build a social media based blockchain that keeps track of users and posts and things like that. Normally it would be expensive and costly to run it on something like Ethereum, and it would be quite a development process. However, with Substrate, we can actually create our own custom blockchain to handle all of that logic for us, and it will be relatively painless to implement that functionality if we wish to do so. Substrate chains are also interoperable. They are quite good at communicating with other blockchains if need be. And this is still in pretty active development. However, you can do things like talk to other Substrate chains, or in the future, even communicate with chains like Ethereum, which I believe has even happened before. So if you need to talk to an Ethereum smart contract from your Substrate chain, then that's entirely possible. But yeah, all you need to know is that Substrate is essentially the Angular or React for JavaScript. It provides a bunch of tools just like Angular or React, and instead of building web applications, we're building blockchains. Okay, now that we have a good idea of what blockchain is and what Substrate is and how they relate to each other, we can dive into some of the guts of Substrate. Don't worry about getting all these concepts right now. The most important part is that at least you know some of the terminology, as we'll be using it later on in the course when we're building our palette and modules. At least you'll be somewhat familiar with them, and it will be pretty easy to at least get a grip on exactly what's going on. So the first aspect, which we'll see a ton when dealing especially with the Substrate node template, is the Substrate runtime. And the runtime is like the beating heart of the blockchain. It's essentially the bit of code that controls and manages all the different modules that make up the blockchain. It facilitates the usage of Frame, which is a super important thing that we're about to get into right now. Frame stands for the Framework for Runtime Aggregation of Modularized Entities. It's a super long acronym. However, it actually does a whole lot of things which we shouldn't take for granted. And essentially what Frame does, it gives us the ability to kind of put different modules together, kind of mix and match different palettes and modules in a way that allows us to create our own blockchain. So essentially what each Substrate chain is it's made up of different Frame modules and palettes. Palettes are modules that contain the business logic for custom blockchain functionality, and you add those palettes to the runtime, and then the runtime manages all those palettes or modules. I use palette and module pretty interchangeably, however, they basically mean the same thing in this context. Later on in the course, this is what we'll be doing. We'll be creating a custom palette or module, and we'll be able to see exactly how that integrates and interacts with our very own blockchain. Each palette handles the submission and signing of transactions in Substrate, and it also handles how we interact and store things on the blockchain as well, which leads us into Substrate storage mechanisms. Substrate has a bunch of APIs that let us interact with the storage of a node, which is basically a database that allows us to store pretty much whatever we want. And there's different mappings and values which we can do. We can store something as simple as a basic value, or we can store something as complex as a mapping of addresses to a bunch of structures, data structures or something like that. Either way, Substrate storage APIs are really crucial for developing new palettes and modules on the blockchain. Alright, nice. Now that we have a really good idea of what we're working with here, let's go ahead and start installing dependencies to get us started. As always, all the instructions for different OSs and different ways to install dependencies are sitting right either in the Notion template or inside within the Udemy course right after this video. However, I just want to go over a couple of cool tools. We'll be installing the front-end template, which gives us a really cool way to interact with our node once we're done developing it, and we'll be able to actually interact with our blockchain and view blockchain data live. Another tool that does this really actively is the Polka.js Explorer, which we can visit right in our browser, and it allows us to view a chain live and view its different metrics right there. You can see, for example, I just loaded up one of my testnet nodes for my messaging protocols network, and we can actually see blocks coming in real time. We can view different metrics, things like latency, whether there was forks in the network, any sort of conflicts, node information, all sorts of cool stuff. So be sure to check out this tool as well as installing the front-end template tool. All right, I'll see you guys when we start building our palette. Alright, now you should have everything installed dependency-wise from the previous section. This includes having the Rust toolchain installed with the nightly version, along with the front-end templates, and you should also have gotten a little bit familiar with the Polka.js Explorer. So now the next thing that we need to do is install the Substrate node templates. Now what this does is it gives us everything we need to build our own frame-based palette as well as our own blockchain. All the commands will be available as usual in the assisting documentation. So what you want to do is you want to go ahead and just git clone this over here, and if you need this repository, it'll be either in the description of the video or in the documentation after the video. So without further ado, let's get it cloned. So right here, we're going to git clone, and I actually set up a custom node template repository that makes it a little bit easier to work with, and we're just going to clone that, and then you want to change directory into it. So cd substrate node -template -course. And once we're in here, you can see that it is a regular Rust project. Oops. It is a regular Rust project with everything you need to create your blockchain. Okay, and the last thing we need to do is we need to actually build it. So let's do cargo build. Actually, let's run it. Cargo run -- release, 2 more dashes, space, and then -- dev to run in development mode. So your command should look just like this. Go ahead and hit run. Now this is gonna take a while to compile. So I suggest you go do something else for maybe 20, maybe 30 minutes. Depending on how fast your system is, this is gonna take a little bit. Okay, and once it's fully compiled, you should see this chain start to run and it should look like this. I stopped it here and I'm going to run it again by running the same exact command as last time, which is cargo run -- release -- and then -- dev. And this will start up a development chain with nothing on it yet. So this essentially has no customization. It's just a purely running blockchain. And as you can see, the blocks are going and the blockchain is working. So congratulations, you just successfully compiled and are running your own, well, not yet custom, but a blockchain or Substrate based chain on your computer. Congrats. So we can actually go to the polkadot.js.org explorer right here, and we can make sure you go here and you select local node and potentially just click switch there and it'll switch to your local node, and click on chain info and you can actually see all the recent blocks starting to populate, and you can see the blockchain actually working in real time in the explorer. So just to verify that it's working, you can come in here and have a look at what your blockchain is doing. With that out of the way, then we can get into actually diving into the core guts of this blockchain node's code, and we can actually start to add our custom module, which is going to be a cool about me, basis of a social media kind of module, which we'll be getting into very, very soon. Okay, so you have the template installed. Now what we can do is actually directly modify the palettes within our templates. There's already a nice palette template within the node template itself, which we're going to be using to create our about me palette. And before I get into that, I will explain exactly what that is. So using our newly installed node template, we can actually customize our very own Substrate palette or blockchain module. And without further ado, what we're going to do is create a simple about me sort of palette using Substrate. Now what this does is it allows us to assign metadata about a user as a mapping to an address or a blockchain address. So versus having to identify a user by some long unreadable address, we'll use metadata like a username and a description about the user maybe, and a set of ID numbers, stuff like that. And that will all be managed by the Substrate node template and the blockchain itself. So to start doing that, go ahead and just cd into the node template. And I'm going to be using VS Code for this. You can use whatever code editor you're comfortable with. I'm going to open it just with code, space, and then the dot to open it in the current directory. Okay. Once we're in here, I'm actually going to exit out of here real quick, just close these up. Now you should be presented with this file structure. On the left hand side, you're going to see all the different parts of the node, including the outer node portion, which we haven't really talked about, but it's there. We have the place where we can manage some palettes if we want to, the runtime, which we talked about before, along with some other things to help the node run. Now what we want to do is we want to go under palettes, templates, and then right here under source, you want to go into lib.rs. This is where we're going to be actually creating our palette, putting all the business logic and things of that nature. There's a few more files here. There's benchmarking, which is a concept which we haven't gone over. This is used just to determine the performance of the functions within our palette for the blockchain. Mock.rs and tests.rs are both used for unit testing and for mocking the chain for when we're actually wanting to unit test our palette, which we won't do here, but just know that it's there. Go back to lib.rs, and here's where we'll start actually modifying this file to contain our business logic to assign information about a user in association with their blockchain address. So before we start actually editing this file, we're going to go over it briefly, just go over the different parts. If you haven't used Rust before, it's not a big deal. I'll take you through it line by line so you don't exactly have to understand everything, but I will go over some basic concepts of kind of what to understand when editing this specific file. So the first thing we do is that we declare a module palette, and within here, this contains everything we need for our palette, including the configuration for the palette, and this is used to configure it within the runtime. And within the palette configuration right here, this pub trait config, we can define custom variables, bounds, limits, whatever pertains to our specific palette's logic, essentially. So for example, we might want to introduce like a message limit, for example, if this palette was going to send messages. Send a message only can hold up to 248 characters, whatever, something like that. We can also define events. If you ever worked with Solidity before, this is the same concept. Events work kind of the same way, where events are used to kind of inform users on the wider blockchain network that, hey, something has happened emitting from this specific palette. So for example, if a user was created, in our case, we could emit an event that says, hey, the user with this address just created, a new identity or something like that. We also have errors. So we can actually throw errors that show up on the chain to make sure to see exactly what users are either doing wrong or how our code is handling things. In general, just, errors. And we can see that these are declared by specific Rust macros. So it defines what an event should look like, what an error should look like, and things of that nature. There's another macro right above the events called deposit events. And this is what we'll be using to actually interact with the event system. And finally, this is where the actual logic goes. They're called dispatchable functions. And what dispatchable functions allow us to do is modify the state of the blockchain, which we talked about earlier. These are done through transactions, or in Substrate, a word that you'll see a lot is extrinsics, which are basically the same concept. They are things that modify the core blockchain. They are essentially state changes that change the state of the blockchain, very similar to a transaction. We can define exactly what these look like, but just know that dispatchable functions do kind of what they say they do, which is interact with the palette and then also invoke state changes. And this is where we define our functions. So we might have a dispatchable function called register_user, and that will do as you expect. It would register a user on the network and say, hey, we want to create this new state change and we want to store the user on the blockchain. All right, now that we've kind of have a basic idea of what we're working with, we can start modifying the file and adding our custom logic. So let's start right under the config here, the pub trait config, which is the palette configuration. Let's enter a few times and let's write some code. So the first thing we're going to do is actually do pub struct. So we're creating a public struct or data structure, and we're calling it user info. Now what we're going to do is we're going to define 3 different fields within this data structure. We're going to have a username stored as an array of bytes, and we're going to declare that as username, and it's going to be an array of bytes. Now what happens here is the Substrate node actually translates this as a string on the front end, so we don't have to worry about it too much. Just know that this is an array of bytes, which is kind of identical to a string in many, many ways. Okay, the next field is going to be a number ID for each user. If you've ever used like Discord or something like that, you'll kind of know what I'm getting at here. So number ID of the user, and this will be an integer, 64-bit integer, as you can see. So pub ID : space I64. Finally, the last field will be the about me section. So the about me section of the user, so they can put like whatever description about themselves or whatever. And we just call that pub about _me : and then another vector of bytes because it's just a string. Okay, once that's done, what you want to do is actually copy, and this will be either in the article right after this video or in the Notion templates if you have access to that. There's some macros we need to add in here, and this basically, all you need to know if you haven't used Rust is this makes the struct way easier to work with. This gives us basically the ability to encode it and decode it in different ways and really manipulate the data as much as we want to without any real repercussions. All right, once we have these structs in place, we can move on to creating our storage map. As we kind of went over earlier in the Substrate deep dive section, this is going to be directly interacting with the node storage. So we need a way to interact with that storage, and we do that using what's called a storage map. It does pretty much exactly as it's implied. It allows you to create a mapping or a hash map, essentially, whatever key you want to whatever value you want. So let's start defining that. So the first thing is we're going to use a Rest macro. So hashtag and then 2 square brackets and inside palettes, : and then storage. This means we're basically telling it, hey, we want to use the APIs or interact with the node storage at this point. You're going to add another macro here in the same fashion, hashtag and square brackets, and you're going to actually do palettes getter, and you're going to declare a function in here. And this basically lets us get information from the storage map later on without having to type a whole dedicated function to it. So it makes it super easy. And the function is just called info in this case. Now, finally, let's declare the storage map. So do pub type, and we're going to call it account to user info. And there's going to be angled brackets. We're going to pass in the configuration because we can actually get access to some very useful types when we do this. And these are called generics in Rust. Again, don't worry about it too much. Just follow the syntax and it would work. And go ahead and set all of this equal to the storage map. So storage map right there. And then we're going to configure the storage map now, and it's going to be an underscore. I'll explain all the syntax in just a second, but so far just bear with me. Underscore Blake2 underscore 128 concat. This basically is the hashing algorithm for the keys when it stores in a hash map. We can actually choose different hashing algorithms, but we're going to use this one. And then we're going to access the account ID type via the generic here. So T::, account ID. And then we're going to pass in a user info. So comma account ID, and then user info, comma. And then finally the last parameter is option query. And then put a semicolon at the end of those brackets. We're going to format that up. All right. Okay, so what did we just type here? So the first thing we did was we declared a storage map, and then we declared a hashing algorithm we want to use for the storage map. And we want to say we want to use the key, which in this case is an account ID, and map this account ID to an instance of user info, so to all this metadata. And then we want it to return an option query, which means that when we query or reach for what's inside of the storage map, it'll either give us none or some value. And this is something also in Rust called an option, which means either it'll give you nothing, and if it's nothing, then we know the user doesn't exist. And if it's something, then it'll give us this data, or this instance of this data of user info. And now in theory, when we go to run this in our node, we can actually say, hey, does this account ID have data associated with it? And this will actually tell us via this info function right here whether or not that user exists on the blockchain or not. Okay, and back to events. So we're gonna go ahead inside the curly brackets here, and we're going to declare a new event. And what we want to do is we want to declare whenever a new user has been created. So let's actually do that. Let's go ahead and just type user created, just like this. 2 more curly brackets. And then you can declare the fields of your event within these curly brackets. So in this case, we just want a user, T::, and then the account ID. The only reason why we're doing this weird syntax here, if you haven't used Rust, is this gives us access to the type config right here, or the trait config, and that has types like account ID within it. So we have to access that via this syntax right here. And we can use this later on inside of our dispatchable function. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to leave errors for now. You can mess with them later if you like. Okay, now finally, this is the last step, which is creating our dispatchable function. This actually handles the business logic and things of that nature right here inside the palette. And the first thing we want to do is we want to copy paste this macro right here. And this will be available, of course, as usual, inside the Notion templates or in the next lecture written version of this video. So here you can see this defines the weight of the function. Don't worry too much about this. Just know that this is just part of creating a dispatchable function. Now right below, you want to type pub fn. We're going to call the function register_user. So we're declaring a public function called register user. And we have a few unique arguments when creating a dispatchable function. So let's get those out of the way real quick. Origin for T. So we're passing in actually the config here. I'll explain exactly what this origin parameter is in just a moment, but let's go ahead and pass in some of the other parameters. So actually we want to pass in the username, of course, which is an array of bytes, the ID, which is an integer, and then finally the about me, which is also an array of bytes. Once you're done there, you want to put a dash right after the parentheses dash, arrow, and then you want to put dispatch results. You want to put the dash arrow and then search for dispatch result as the return type right here. And then put 2 curly brackets. Now we're going to get errors at first because it wants us to return something, which is normal. We'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, we declared a function called register user, which is a public function, meaning that anyone can call it under the palette's call macro. And then within this function, we have several parameters here. First is the origin. The origin basically passes in all the necessary information on who called this function, and basically the origin of whoever called this specific dispatchable function. Next, it's pretty self-explanatory. We pass in the username when we call this function, the ID, and then the about me. And in here, we can actually start writing the logic we need to assign these parameters to whoever called the function or the origin of the function. So first we actually want to get the caller or the sender of this function, whoever called it. We'll do right now. So within these curly brackets, type let sender equal ensure signed, and then pass in the origin right here, and a question mark, and then a semicolon. Now you can see here it says this is actually an account ID, so we actually get an account ID out of this, which we can use to map to user info later in this function. Next, we want to define a new user. So let's actually use these parameters to create a new data structure, user info, right here inside of our palettes function. So let's new user equal to user info to curly brackets, and then you can pass in the username, ID, and about me in that order. And just like that, we successfully utilize our data structure that we just created earlier. Okay, so after we define our sender as such and our user as such, we want to modify the node's inner storage with this specific special call, so 2 angled brackets, and then you want to call our storage mapping, which we called account ID to user info. Yep, account to user info. Inside of here, you want 2 more angled brackets. You want to put T because we're passing the config right here. 2 more colons, insert, and then inside of here, pass in a reference to the sender. So & sender, and then pass in also the new user, which is the value. Right, and this actually stores it within the node. So now we're storing the sender's key, the account ID, in association to the value, which is the new user. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to emit an event once it's stored that this actually occurred. So to do that, we're going to actually call self : deposit underscore event, and then type event inside the parentheses, : 2 angle brackets, T, and then : again, and then user created, which is the event that we defined earlier. And you can see here it's showing up. And then 2 more curly brackets, user, and the user in this case is the sender. And we put a semicolon at the end of all of that. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to just return OK with 2 parentheses like this. And this will return the function. Basically what happens here in Rust is if something goes wrong, it'll throw the error. Otherwise, it'll just return OK like this. Okay, and just like that, we actually have completed all the business logic for our palettes. We're assigning metadata in association with an account ID to give the account ID more meaning and more value in the long run. Now, if we run and compile this, we'll be able to assign users with information and then also get that information via the blockchain. Okay, congratulations, you just completed your first custom blockchain module or palettes in the Substrate framework. Okay, so now we can actually get out of the IDE or the code editor here, go back to our terminal, which would still be inside of the node templates directory. And what we want to do is we want to cargo run it again. So we want to build it with cargo and actually get our node up and running. So type cargo run -- release -- and then -- dev and hit run. This should take a little bit to build because it's going to compile the palettes that you just wrote and everything like that. It's going to recompile those parts. So give it a little bit of time and let it do its thing. And make sure you have the Substrate front-end template installed, as this will be pretty crucial going forward in testing our node. And once your node is compiled with your palettes in place, it should look something like this. It should start like this. You should see the blocks starting to populate just like we saw initially when we started without the palettes. And you should also have the front-end template installed, and we will also get that running right now. So while your blockchain is running, go into another tab in your terminal, get out of the node directory, and you want to go into the front-end one instead. Once you're inside of your Substrate front-end templates directory, you want to go ahead and run You want to run yarn install if you haven't already, and if you already have, go ahead and just do yarn start and get this started. And once it is started, you should see this on your terminal with your front-end templates running, and this one should be running with your node template. So you should have your node running and your front-end running at the same time right here, just like this. And if we bring up the browser right here, this should also open up. Go to localhost 8000 in case it hasn't. You can see the blocks updating in real time. You can see account balances and things like that. You can also see where you can perform forkless upgrades to your chain. So like change the runtime on the fly, just like what we discussed earlier. And here you can also see you can transfer currency from one account to another in this front end as well. But what we really want to do is pay attention to two specific things, the palette interactor and also events. Scroll down the palette interactor and I'm going to zoom in on it just a little bit. And if we click this arrow, we can see template module pops up amongst the other palettes. You can select that, and under callables, you can actually see the function that we created in the previous videos. So register user, and this pops up all the different fields that we populated inside of our palette here. So let's go ahead and actually assign a new user. So our user's name will be Alice with an ID of 1234, and the about me is hi, my name is Alice. And click signed, because this is going to be a signed transaction to the network. And as you can see, once it gets submitted on the right, the events are going to reflect that. So you can clearly see here one specific event, which is one that we defined, created a new user with this address. And if you look up here, you can see that we're actually selected as Alice here with this address right here, and it matches with this one. So actually what we want to do is copy that address. So copy that from here, and then go to query in your palette interactor. Click palettes, and then click on template module, callables, and now account to user info, which is our storage mapping if you recall. Right here, paste the address in this field, click query, and you can actually see our username and account ID and everything like that all popping up right here. It's in hexadecimal, but trust me, it says what we put before. Actually, don't trust me, go to the Polka.js Explorer from earlier and make sure it's selected to your local node. Now what you want to do is you can go to actually what you want to do is go to developer, chain state. And right here in selected state query, click the arrow, click template module, and now you can see our storage mapping pop up. Make sure it's selected to Alice because that's what we did right here. And go ahead and press the plus sign. Now we can see that it did the query and it returned username Alice, ID 1234, and hi, my name is Alice as the about me. So congratulations, you just stored user metadata on the blockchain using your very own custom-made blockchain module or palette using the Substrate blockchain framework. Okay, now bear with me, I'm going to go over one more thing and then we can actually run and test this thing. I want you to head over back to your left-hand panel or wherever your file directory is. I want you to go into runtime, source, and then lib.rs with inside the runtime folder. So now this is the runtime that we discussed earlier in the flesh. You can see here it imports a bunch of different palettes, including balances, timestamp, transactions, payments, whatever logic that this template was equipped with initially. All of that is included within the runtime right here. And this includes our palette template, or whatever we just created is also imported here. We can see here that there's numerous configurations for each palette for the runtime, and that's pretty self-explanatory via the REST syntax in this case. So for example, this one says implement the palette transaction payment for the runtime. And this has a bunch of custom variables here, which you can have a look at. If we scroll down, we can see also our palette template is also registered in this runtime. In this case, we just have to define what an event looks like, but if we wanted more custom variables, we can add that in the future. Last but not least, you can actually see that it is also registered in this very special macro called constructor runtime. And this kind of puts all the runtime modules together, which you can see in this list, including our templates module, our custom module right here. And by the way, this says template module, but this is just what we created right here in the previous videos. Feel free to look through the rest of the file and kind of investigate and mess with whatever you want. Try not to break anything. But now we can get to testing and building this thing. So congratulations, you just successfully created and ran your very own blockchain based off of Substrate, created a custom module, and learned quite a bit about various things about Rust and blockchain in the process. So what's next? You can actually look into extending your palette now. You have full customizability over your palette. So you can look at extending your configuration here. You could add specific lengths for things like the about me, so you could limit it and bind it in some way to keep it from overflowing. And then I would also highly encourage you to read through the Substrate docs and learn even more about the different things that we kind of glossed over. And as usual, everything will either be available here in Notion or in a separate written lecture right after the video. It's also worth mentioning that we also have a Discord community, which I will probably have to update this link at the time of this recording. However, you will be able to join it and join a community of Web3 and blockchain developers and creators, people who actually want to build things that make a difference in the world. And of course, you'll have direct access to me if you do so. If you have any questions or anything like that, I'll be hanging out right here.